Hello everybody, this is my audio report of a war game I played with my friend Raymond. This was the very first time I had run these rules called Altar of Freedom, a very excellent set of American Civil War rules. And we did this battle in just under 3 hours. We probably could have done it a lot quicker, but we had to stop and start at several points to explain rules and get game concepts down. And I feel if this same battle played by us like a week from now, probably would have only taken like an hour and a half, maybe an hour and 45 minutes tops. I really enjoy Altar of Freedom for that reason. It's fast, and it's not a game that loses from what I've seen so far, from watching it online from other players and from reading the rules. It's not a game that loses a lot for its speed and ease of play. You still have all the main features of the era's combat to be concerned about: command and control, sighting. If you're using Fog of War rules, those are there. And the big one that I don't often see represented in wargaming rules, the character of the generals. I really like the idea of the general trait system. So, I made lots of mistakes. You're going to hear the ones that I know I caught. Here we go. Stanton is a train station somewhere in the southern side of, like, Pennsylvania. And the game time real world would probably be somewhere just after the Battle of Gettysburg. It's looking like 1863. And the Union player with 2 divisions has been told to take Stanton, and he has to have it by the end of day 2. Now, I realize that's not a normal AOF rule, but it felt like a good way to introduce the players to the game. The Confederacy has 2 divisions. The divisions on all sides are pretty equally matched, again, for the sake of showing players the rules. And you'll see that evenness gave a lot of back and forth to the game. On turn 1, at roughly 8 a.m., the first day of the battle, the Union gained control of the turn clock. Here's where my first misunderstanding of the rules would have greatly changed the flow of the rest of play, because I had us subtracting time from the turn clock before a priority bid moved, rather than after it moved. And as a result, there were several times when divisions couldn't move, when they normally would have been able to. The Confederacy won the first priority bid and marched the Confederacy's 1st Division towards Stanton Station, which is where the second error in understanding the rules occurred, because this unit was on a road, and though I could have used the road reserve movement by placing it at Stanton right away, I'd forgotten about it. So as a result, it took the Confederacy a couple of turns to get into Stanton, when really I designed the scenario for them to get in there right away. The Union forces begin advancing on Stanton by dividing their approach. The Union 1st Division begins to suddenly advance across the open ground, while the Union 2nd Division marches around the forest that screens it from Stanton and the river that cuts through the northern part of the map. The Confederacy's 2nd Division attempts to march, but the turn clock expires before the division can get moving. At roughly 9 a.m. on day 1, the Confederacy again gains control of the turn clock. The 1st Division marches into Stanton and takes control of it. The 2nd Confederate Division begins to break apart, sending its artillery to support the 1st Confederate Division in Stanton, while the infantry march along the river along the south of Stanton. The 2nd Division's cavalry ride behind the southern forest to screen them from view. The Union's 1st Division maneuvers and manages to be just outside the range of the Confederate artillery batteries of the 1st Division. The Union's 2nd Division maneuvers through some difficult ground just past the rail bridge to the northeast of Stanton. At roughly 10 a.m. on day 1, the first actual shots are fired. The Confederacy wins control of the turn clock again, and opens up on the Union players' 1st Division as they race for the cover of the wood line. The Union infantry suffer 1 brigade being struck, and though the men are rattled, the unit keeps pace. Essentially, I rolled a 1 to 3 on the shooting die, so no damage was done. The Union's 2nd Division then breaks apart, sending its cavalry down the rail line as the infantry march across the bridge. The Union artillery and command are sheltered in the center of this formation, but then the Union player spots the Confederate cavalry across the river on their flank, and the Confederate 2nd Division coming around the southern forest. At roughly 11 a.m. on day 1, the Confederacy's 2nd Division cavalry screens the strength of the Union 2nd Division. Now, this is a rule in AOF where cavalry can actually see the troop strength modifiers of any unit within 6 inches of them. And I used this to get a sense of which one of the divisions I was fighting, because although I knew what troops were where, my opponent may have switched them around. I should rephrase that. Though I know what brigades are supposed to be in which division, I wasn't sure exactly which brigade was which because we were using a type of marker where the strength modifier is not visible to you. It's on the flipped back of the unit for the player to see that controls that unit, but I as the aggressor can't. If you think of like a risk piece, that's kind of like what I was using to test these rules. The Union's 1st Division then marches through the woods, but it's being shelled by Confederate batteries of both the 1st and 2nd Confederate Divisions, which are now both in Stanton. 2 Union brigades are struck, and one almost falls out of march. Essentially, it fell back in place, it recoiled. The turn ends with the Confederate cavalry pulling back to the bridge after they have conducted their screening. And that's the bridge on the eastern side of Stanton. You can see it on the map. Roughly at noon on day 1, the Union 1st Division fails to move and is shelled again by the Confederate batteries, but this time to little effect. On the eastern side of Stanton, a volley of fire between the Union cavalry and Confederate units produces few dead on each side, but no loss of determination. The Union cavalry here slam into a Confederate infantry unit and are forced to retreat from the savage Confederate defense. This last-minute defense is bolstered by the Confederate 2nd Division commander personally commanding the defensive line. He was in base-to-base contact with the infantry unit that got struck, and perhaps leading cavalry to fight in like old dragoon style to help bolster the infantry position. The Confederate cavalry of the 2nd Division, because they had 2 brigades of cavalry, charge ahead to catch a Union infantry unit trying to ford across the river and run into it, causing disarray and a retreat from the Union brigade. They, however, have less impact on the Union troops that have already secured their position on the eastern bank. As 1 p.m. rolls around, there is more fire in the tall grass, and the cannons continue to bombard the Union 1st Division, which loses a turn as it's befouled in the woods. 2 Union brigades are lightly harmed. The Confederate commander, sensing an opportunity, sends his cavalry of 1st Division and a pair of his 1st Division infantry brigades to try to break the 2nd Union Division. Rifle fire all along the eastern Union/Confederate line produces no heavy effects, but the Union is slowly pushed back towards its cannon. And here the Union player suffers a great disadvantage, for the Union units are all between the cannon and the enemy, preventing the cannon from bringing their big guns to bear upon the enemy units. Across the river, the Confederate cavalry are tied up with Union infantry and manage to push them back. By 2 p.m., the eastern side of the conflict continues, with rifle fire erupting between the infantry and cavalry. But no decisive damage is done. A gap appears in the Union lines that the Confederates attempt to exploit by sending an infantry brigade through, only to see that it was an intended opening by the Union division commander. The big guns open up on the Confederate infantry brigade and drive it back. The Confederate 1st Division begins digging into Stanton with the creation of field works and moves its 1st Division cavalry behind a screen of Confederate infantry. The Confederate batteries continue to pound at the Union 1st Division but do not manage to slow them down. The Confederate cavalry charge across the river is turned back, though it also forces the Union brigade that it hit to retreat. By 3 p.m., both commanders are feeling anxious. The Union does not want the Confederacy to be in Stanton on the morning of the 2nd day, yet it cannot seem to press past the determined defenders in the east. Then perhaps command failures or the exertions of the day take hold, and the Confederate 1st Division does not get to move as the turn clock expires. This allows the Union 1st Division to clear the woods to the west with minimal artillery fire being taken. By 4 p.m. on the first day, both the Union 1st and Confederate 1st Divisions fail to maneuver before the turn clock expires. The Union 2nd Division fights off a cavalry raid and fires across the river to skirmish with the Confederate unit. At 5 p.m. of the first day, the Confederate 1st Division again fails to maneuver, and the action on the eastern line swings into Confederate favor as a Union brigade breaks and runs for their rear headquarters. Though the Union does not manage to push the Confederate attacks backward, a Confederate cavalry skirmish backs 2 Union units against the river, promising a possible break in them if they can just get a bit more momentum on the next turn. By 6 p.m. of the first day, it becomes clear that the Union push for Stanton will take at least another day. At the end of the day's battle, both sides have something to feel confident about. The Confederates seem to have Stanton well in control and are dug in, though they perhaps do not have enough units on the western side of Stanton to hold it if the Union makes a determined push. The Union, on the other hand, has almost a full fresh division ready to barrel down on Stanton once the morning arrives. Night movement has the Confederates adjust troops, bringing 2 infantry brigades back to guard Stanton and recalling their cavalry from across the river. Under the cover of darkness, the Union positions its 1st and 2nd Division's guns for the second day's push. At dawn on the second day, the Confederate commander realizes his mistake. He has been far too aggressive on the Yankees coming through the tall grass. Indecisive on how to adjust for this, the 2nd Division commander suddenly falls prey to a character fault noted in his academy days. Namely, he seeks glory. This was actually a commander trait that I made up for this scenario, where on a 1-2 on a D6, this particular Confederate commander, regardless of his other orders, will simply order his entire division forward towards the nearest enemy position. The 2nd Confederate Division surges forward towards the Union 2nd Division. The initial push shows great promise, causing a Union cavalry brigade to break and run for the northern line, but the Confederate infantry pay a high price for this surge, and 2 of them fall back severely exhausted. The Yankee rifle fire pushes back 1 more Confederate cavalry brigade, and the Confederacy just manages to set itself up for the envelopment that the 2nd Division commander dreamed of the night before. The Confederate 1st Division aids this assault, and the Confederate batteries fire on the Union advancing 1st Division as it makes its way towards Stanton. And then there is suddenly a sign, a moment, when it seems that God must truly favor the Southern cause. Or perhaps the referee misunderstood the rules. You see, when AOF said that generals count as a supporting unit for close combat, I assumed that meant the generals could be fired upon just like any other unit. And because of the way the general piece was positioned, it was the closest unit towards my guns. So I had both of my artillery batteries open up on the general, and as a result, on the fire contest, we ended up with a recoil back and fatigue, and I had thought that if a general takes fatigue, you have to roll on the general fate table, and he died. So as this artillery barrage lands around the Union general, he is slain by the wrath of the 12-pounders, and this halts the Union advance of the 1st Division, causing them to remain ready for action but unable to advance. At 7 a.m., the Confederate reckless attack cost them 2 broken brigades, which then retreat to the headquarters in Stanton that the Confederates moved to the train station during the night. But the Confederate cavalry manages to capture the Union's 2nd Division commander in close combat. The Union, not to be slighted, managed to break another Confederate cavalry unit with defensive fire. The 1st Union Division is taken control of by an adjunct commander, who then begins to enact the advance towards Stanton on the next turn. At 8 a.m., the Confederacy can see only a massive roll of blue bellies in the grass firing against them, and 2 more Union units break as they excuse me. Let me repeat that. At 8 a.m., the Confederacy can see only a massive roll of blue bellies in the grass as 2 more Union units break, and they captured the 2nd Union's division's cannons. But unfortunately for the Confederacy, the 1st Union divisions, now underway, are nearing Stanton. The Confederacy feels its opponent's cannons pound the hastily repositioned Confederate defenders. By 9 a.m., the Confederacy suffers a unit east of Stanton breaking in the face of the pure number of the Blue Jackets that are advancing in their position. A single Confederate unit charges for the Union's guns, left behind as the Union infantry advanced. And while this Confederate unit does manage to capture the Union's guns, the Union infantry march up the road almost unopposed. The Union cavalry take the Confederate positions and destroy the force of Confederates and force another unit to retreat. That is, they force one battery of cannons to retreat and they capture the other. A Confederate infantry brigade breaks in the face of this onslaught, and while the fighting in the grass continues, the Confederate cavalry secure the west end of the position. That is over in the tall grass. At 10 a.m., the Union's 1st Division takes the positions their cavalry had formerly raided, and the cavalry surge forward and destroy the Confederate headquarters in Stanton. The Confederate Army commander is forced to call for retreat before his army breaks, as his 1st Division commander is slain by Union infantry in the taking of Stanton. And that was the first game. We ended up with the Confederacy having 1 more unit on the battlefield than the Union, if I remember correctly. But when they broke, it was just like one after another. It was like I was doing really well there at the start of the second turn, and then everything fell apart because I got way too aggressive and didn't leave enough units on my western side of Stanton to defend it from the Union advance. Ray didn't feel like he had done very well, but actually he did fairly well. He had his 2 divisions go around the terrain correctly. He managed to keep them all in line. The thing that happened with the cannons is because I forgot to tell him, and he assumed that cannons could fire over the heads of his infantry, that the AOF rules don't allow for that. and otherwise that wouldn't have happened, and so that would have changed the battle and the tall grass a lot. We also weren't using all the fog of war rules. I decided to not throw too much information at the players too fast, so I didn't really use LOS in the wood line. Normally LOS in the wood line works if there's 2 inches of woods between you and the targets. You can't fire on them. But because I had a bunch of tall grass on the field, it was also counting as rough ground, and the woods too, I decided to let that rule go and just play the battle as it was, because it was going to be bloody enough. And it was. I mean, some of the back and forth close combat was really back and forth. I mean, this battle as I designed it could have gone either way, and had it not been for a couple of misunderstanding of the rules, I think the Union player would have even done better. So that was our first AOF battle, and I'm sorry I got kind of ragged there on the end, but I kept trying to record it and kept messing up and getting frustrated, and I don't have access to a computer program that lets me edit, so I just kind of have to do it all live stream into the mic. And there we go. I intend to play the same battle with Civil War history buff and former reenactor, a friend of mine named Matt. I'm going to let him and Ray divide a corps between them, so they each have one division, and then I'll just play the other. And hopefully we'll get everything set up so we can actually do an alternate Civil War history campaign I want to call Brothers' Blood, starting with First Manassas and going all the way through the war, wherever that takes us. So, thank you for listening.